opportunity to be able to gather and to talk about him and remember him, and inshallah in doing that to get to know him and to worship him, inshallah. And our Prophet, he beautifully said that when people gather, when Muslims or believers gather to remember God, to talk about God, to worship God, then angels descend and they embrace all of those present, and they end up filling the space from the land in which those people are gathered all the way up to the heavens. So alhamdulillah, we thank God for that angelic presence here today. So I titled my talk Heart Ethics, Ethics in Light of the Qur'an and the People Who Live by It. So I gave it this title. I wanted to talk about these two things, the heart and ethics, because I think they're both very fundamental to our lives as human beings. And for the heart at least, it's a topic that comes up over and over again in the Qur'an. There are numerous verses in which God talks about the heart. He talks about all different kinds of hearts. Hearts that are crusted over, hearts that are deaf, dumb, and blind, and hearts that remember God. And then also I wanted to talk about ethics, because ethics boils down to choices, and we make choices with our heart. And the first choice that we make, the first ethical choice that we make, is to bear witness to the divine reality. And we make that ethical choice before we're put into this realm as human beings. So God says in the Qur'an that He asked us in our spiritual form, He asked us, "Am I not your Lord?" And we replied, of course you're our Lord. There could be nothing, more true than that. And so that's our first ethical choice. But then our second ethical choice, which you could say is our first that we make in this realm as human beings, as people inside of physical bodies, is to recommit to that first ethical choice, to recommit to the worship of God, to knowing God. And so those are the two reasons why I chose to talk about the heart and ethics. But I could also say another reason why I chose to talk about the heart in specific is because when I found out that I was doing this talk, which is when my mother told me I was doing this talk, I decided to call one of my teachers and I asked him, I'm doing this talk and I'm not really quite sure what to talk about. And he said, well, just speak from your heart. And so I thought, okay, I will speak from my heart and I will talk about the heart, and inshallah it'll be okay. So what I want to do is take you through a 4-step process. And this 4-step process is called the 4 causes. And it's called the 4 causes. It was invented by Aristotle, so it's a very old process. And it's something that I learned in school. And so the purpose of the 4 causes, we can say the 4 qualities for our purposes, because I think it's a little bit more understandable when you say qualities. So the purpose of the 4 qualities is to understand something to the best ability that you can, and to the best ability that that thing can actually be understood. So the purpose is simply to understand something to the best extent possible. And so Aristotle came up with these 4 causes, and so the first of them is the material cause. And the material cause answers the question, what is it made out of? And then the efficient cause answers the question, well, who made it? And then the formal cause, the third cause, answers the question, what is it called? And then the last cause, the final cause, answers the question, well, what is its purpose? Why does it need to exist? Why was it created? And so if we look at the 4 causes or the 4 qualities of a heart, then inshallah we'll have a good grasp of what a heart is by the time that we're done. And so the first cause, the materiality of the heart. So there are many, like I said, there are numerous verses in the Qur'an in which God talks about the heart, about what the heart is, about what kinds of hearts there are. And also the Prophet Muhammad talked about the heart very often. And so there are numerous verses that we can go off of. And so for one, the Prophet said that, verily in the body there is a piece of flesh. If it sounds, the whole body is sound. If it's corrupted, the whole body is corrupted. Indeed, it is the heart, right? And the Prophet also said that the heart is like a feather blowing in the wind of the desert. And the wind scatters it to and fro, moves it to and fro. And then God, when He talks about the heart, He says many things, but one of the things that He says is that the location, the place of faith is in the heart. And he also says that the Qur'an is a reminder, and it's a reminder to hearts. So we get, at least from the first hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that the heart does have an aspect of materiality. But we also get that it is pretty much essentially a spiritual thing when we're talking about the heart. The emphasis is on the spirit. Because obviously, if we're talking about the heart being something that remembers, we're talking about the heart being something that fluctuates. We're not really talking about the heart that's located in the chest, but there is a relation to that. And so we get that what the heart is made out of is both something material and something immaterial. So now we've answered the question of the materiality of the heart. And so the second question that we need to answer is, well, who made the heart? Because something I think that was very insightful about Aristotle is that he realized, and Aristotle was really a commonsensical kind of guy, and he realized, or he brought to light the fact that when we evaluate a thing, we often evaluate who made that thing, right? So if we're talking about food, if we're talking about, many people are concerned about who made their food. Are the people who grow the food, are they treated properly, right? Even if we look at children, when we talk about children, when we observe children, then we often ask, well, who are the parents of these children? Who made these children? Who crafted them? Because we believe, as human beings, that something's very commonsensical, but we believe that whoever made a thing had an imprint on that thing. And so that imprint is immaterial. Obviously, they might have crafted it with their hands, but we believe that they also imbued it with something of themselves. And so when we talk about the heart, who made the heart, then the obvious answer is that God made the heart. And so, if we look at who made a thing, we can sort of judge that thing a little bit better. And so, in order then to understand the heart more and to understand the efficient cause of who made it, then we need to understand a bit about God, about who is God, this maker of the heart. And so there are numerous verses, of course, in which God talks about himself and in which the Prophet Muhammad talks about God. But at least one story from the Qur'an that I think is very important when talking about who God is the story of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. And so we get this story in the Qur'an in which Prophet Ibrahim is simply gazing up at the stars. He's gazing up at the constellations, looking up at the sky. And he's there for a very long time because he's there long enough to see the stars rise and set. He's there long enough to see the moon rise and set. And he's observing this, beautiful spectacle that is the heavens. But he concludes, he realizes, or at least he's able to articulate for the first time something that maybe he wasn't able to before, but he says, my Lord is not the Lord that rises and sets. Because he recognized that rising and setting was a quality of creation. Everything in creation rises and sets. Everything in creation blooms and then dies. Everything in creation comes into creation and then goes out of creation. And Ibrahim is saying that can't possibly be the same for the God who created everything, for the Creator. And so he realizes an important quality about God, and that quality is that God is constant. He's constant. He's always present. He doesn't rise and set. Horizons don't overtake him. He's always present. And something very interesting is that in the language of the Arabs, one of the ways that they defined love, one of the qualities they gave love, is that love is something that is constant. Right? They said love is something constant, and they also said that it's something that is an inclination of the heart. And so if we understand that concept of love, and if we begin to understand God, then we'll realize that God is the easiest being there is to love, because he's the most constant being that there is. Everything else passes away, but he's the one who's always there. And on that note, the poet Rumi, he said, talking to God, he said, every question that I ask is about you, God, and every step that I take is toward you, God. And so basically he was saying what God says about himself, which is that God is omnipresent, that God is the one who doesn't fade away when everything else is going to fade away. And so Rumi is bringing up the point that we're always going towards God, whether we choose to do so willingly or whether we have to be dragged there. And so now we've answered the material and the efficient causes of a heart. So material, we say that the heart is both material and spiritual, so it has both a physical and a non-physical component, and that the emphasis is on the spiritual. And then in terms of who made the heart, God made the heart. And so then if we're talking about the formal cause of the heart, so the formal cause answers the question, what is it called? Why is it called that? Maybe linguistically, why is it called that? And so if we look at the Arabic word for heart, there are many actually words for heart in Arabic, but one of them, which I think is the most common, is qalb, and it's the one that has been used in the hadith and the verses that I mentioned before about the heart. And so what's very interesting about this word qalb is that linguistically it means something that fluctuates, something that turns about, something that it doesn't stay still, it's very affected by things. And in a hadith, or I should say in a dua of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, a dua that is still very, very, you could say, famous till this day, the Prophet says, Ya muqallib al-qulub, thabit qalbi ala dinik. He says, oh, you who turn about hearts, establish my heart on this deen. And if you can see, the Prophet, the word that he uses to refer to God is al-muqallib, which is, you can see it has the same letters as qalb, the word for heart. And that's because, obviously, the Prophet is extremely insightful, and what he's saying here is, oh, you who turn about the thing that turns about, basically. And he's saying, when you're turning about my heart, as you often do, then once you land it on faith, please let it stick there. Please don't let it ever come up from faith. And so it helps us understand this nature of the heart to turn about. And so the heart is something that is very receptive. It's probably the most, you could say, receptive thing that we have on us, in us as human beings. It's the thing that is most deeply affected by the signs of God, by the light of God, and also by darkness, affected deeply by evil. And this is an important quality about the heart, because we want our hearts to be open and receptive to the light and the guidance of God. And so, on that note, God says something very interesting in the Qur'an. He says, talking to the believers, but referring to another group of believers from old, he says, isn't it time that those who believe that they should humble their hearts to the worship of God, to the remembrance of God, and to the truth that has been revealed, and that they should not be like those of old, who they were given the scripture, but somehow the time seemed too long for them, and they became ungodly. And what's interesting is that right after this verse, God says that one of his signs is that he gives life to dead earth. It's very interesting, because it seems like what he's saying is that he gives life to dead hearts. And so when we're looking at this verse, one of the groups of people who God could be referring to is the Bani Israel. Because the Bani Israel, they had been obviously monotheists for a very long time. And their prophet was Musa. But what happened? Musa had to go away. He had to go away for 30 days and do his fast. And Bani Israel knew he was returning. He said he would return. But after 30 days, something happened. He had an incident, and he ended up having to fast 10 more days. So it ended up being 40 days. So although the Bani Israel expected him to come back after 30 days, he didn't show up. And in that time, something very unfortunate happened with the Bani Israel. What happened is that they decided that they would build a statue of a golden calf. They decided they would worship a golden calf. And so this is a very peculiar story, because these are people who had been monotheists for a very long time. They had a prophet living in their midst, and yet somehow he left for a few weeks, he came back, and they were worshiping a statue of a cow that they built with their own hands. And so something very important for us to take as a lesson is that we don't have a prophet living in our midst, like the way Bani Israel had a prophet literally living with them. And we don't necessarily have 1,000 years of Islam running in our genes. Many of us might be converts, might be children of converts, grandchildren of converts. And so we don't necessarily have that very formulated, strict tradition of Islam that goes way, way back in our ancestry. And so how is it that, these group of people who had been, believers for a very long time, in a matter of weeks, literally, they had a dramatic change of faith? And so it's a lesson for us, because although we are saved from that kind of, polytheism, our prophet said that we're saved from that kind of polytheism, he didn't say that we were saved from a lesser kind of polytheism, a kind of polytheism that could be what some people call the worship of the self, the idol of the self. Because God talks about in the Qur'an people who they worship themselves, they worship their desires, and that's something very real, and people do it to lesser and greater extents, so it's for us to be on guard that that can really happen. And also a very interesting story is in Surah Yasin. So in Surah Yasin, which the Prophet calls this surah the heart of the Qur'an, the qalb of the Qur'an. So in Surah Yasin we get the story of a town. And there are messengers who come to that town. And scholars say that the town was Antioch, and that the messengers who came to that town were actually the disciples of Jesus. And so they came to this town, and they were healing the sick, and they were feeding the unfed, and they were clothing the unclothed. And then finally they decided to teach the truth about Islam, to teach about the prophecy of Prophet Yusuf. But the people of the town were extremely hostile. They didn't accept the message. And, the prophets came to them and said, we're prophets from you, we're prophets to you, we're coming with a message from the all-merciful God. And the people said, no, you're not prophets, you're men just like us, and there is no message from the all-merciful God. And, the messengers tried to reiterate this message, but the people of the town, they're not listening, they're very hostile. And they say to them, we take a bad omen from you. We take a bad omen from you, and if you don't stop preaching what you're preaching, we're going to stone you, we're going to cast you out, we're going to inflict severe pain upon you. And the messengers, these disciples of Isa, they say something very interesting. They say, no, it's not that you take a bad omen. It's not that you've seen a bad omen. But rather the bad omen is inside of you. So in other words, these people didn't have the sorts of hearts that could see signs and interpret them correctly. They thought that they could. They were misled into thinking that they had the kind of hearts who could see truth and understand truth. But in fact, what we learn from these disciples of Isa is that they didn't. And what we learn is something very interesting, and it's also something that we should be wary of, which is that the heart can get to a state if it does too much sinning, and if it is too heedless, too forgetful of God, then it can get into a state where it's all projection. It can't really see and read signs anymore. It's always projecting onto reality instead of reading reality for itself. And so that's a lesson for us all to take, that we can't ever be 100% sure that we see the truth as the truth. Because if we sin is like a cloud over our hearts. It doesn't mean that we'll never be able to see truth as truth and falsehood as falsehood, but it does mean that it becomes a little bit gloomy inside for us, and that sometimes we're a little bit off the mark. And so this is a lesson for us to take into consideration. Now, the relationship between God and the heart is a very intimate one. And God says that the heart of the child of Adam is between the two fingers of the All-Merciful, right? And this goes back to the dua of the Prophet before, O you who turn about hearts, turn my heart and establish it on deen. So God is saying that, he really does have a hold on our hearts, and he's the one who's in charge here. And if we want him to help us in the deen, to help us with our faith, then we have to ask him, because he's the one who's controlling the fluctuations of our heart. And God says that he looks at our hearts. The Prophet said that God doesn't look at our forms or our bodies, but instead he looks at our hearts. And so we know that our heart is the top priority. So let's say if we spend more time looking in the mirror at our bodies than we do looking at our hearts, then we know we've gotten things upside down. Because God isn't looking at our bodies to see how we look. It's people who are looking at our bodies to see how we look. It's God who's looking at our hearts, and it's people who can't really see our hearts. So if we're concerned about our relationship with God, then we need to be concerned about our relationship with our hearts and how we see our hearts and how we're controlling and managing our hearts. And so one thing that I remember hearing a Shaykh say, and I'm reminded of it in part because one of my classmates, Mahassin, is here, and she went to the masjid of this Shaykh when she was younger. His name is Ram Hayyuddin. And he would say to his students, he would say, God is always ready to give, but we have to be ready to receive. And so it's a really profound concept because God is the ultimate giver, right? And we can be our ultimate selves, and we can have our ultimate hearts if we are able to harness the power of receiving. Because God is giving, so the proper role for us is to receive. And so what is it that we're receiving? Well, one of the things we're receiving is the remembrance of God, because God says that, don't they have hearts that remember, right? Don't they have hearts that remember? And the beautiful thing about remembrance is that remembrance puts you in the present moment, right? And so the Qur'an is called the remembrance. It's called the reminder. And so what it's supposed to do when you read it is it's supposed to put you in the present moment. Because the thing about being present and being the kind of person who remembers is that when you remember, you worship God. When you remember, you want to be near to God. It's when we forget about God, it's when we forget about our hearts that we sin. And so we need to have hearts that are supple and open enough to remember God. And hopefully in doing that, we'll be able to worship him properly and get to know him properly. Now the heart is the only creation that receives revelation. It's the only creation of God that receives revelation. And God says that if he had revealed the Qur'an upon a mountain, the mountain would have crumbled, right? So he didn't do that. He revealed it upon the heart of the Prophet Muhammad, the person who had the biggest heart out of all of us. And so this is very important, and it hints again at the spiritual nature of the heart. Because if you compare the physicality or the physical strength of a heart to a mountain, then obviously the mountain wins. But if you compare the spiritual strength of a heart to a mountain, then the heart will win every time. And so why was it that the revelation could be revealed upon the heart of the Prophet Muhammad? So one of the reasons, if not the main reason, is that the Prophet, he had the biggest heart. And we have this term, having a big heart, even, in the English language, this term of having a big heart. And what does that mean? It means we have a heart that's wide open, a heart that can receive the light of God and can do something with it. So for instance, when the Prophet received revelation, it wasn't as if he simply heard someone talking and someone saying, okay, chapter 1, verse 1, this is what it's going to be. It wasn't like that. It was a full body experience. Sometimes he felt like he was going to die. Sometimes he felt like he was inside like a church bell that was ringing. And so we're not talking about him simply hearing someone say the revelation and then him repeating it to us. We're talking about a very profound almost near-death experience that he would go through to get this revelation. But what was he able to do with the kind of heart that he had? He was able to translate that revelation into something intelligible for all of us. So he was able to, because you can't really communicate what he felt when he had that experience of receiving revelation. He could really only tell you those words and embody the scripture for himself. And that's what the prophet did, but that's because he had a heart that was wide open in that way, a heart that was so receptive, and a heart that was really functioning, a heart that could really do its job. And we have another beautiful example of a big heart. And this example is of Miriam. Now, Mary is a very interesting story. She's a very interesting case. And we see that Mary's mother, yes, an interesting case. We see that Mary's mother had devoted, her child's life to the service and worship of God before her child was even born, before she even knew what her child looked like. She said, okay, my child is going to worship God. I'm going to give him to the service of God. Now, when Mary was born, Mary's mother was slightly disappointed, we could say, because she thought, let's not say she thought, but she had hoped she would have a male, because she felt like a male, in her mind, a male would be able to do that job a bit better. A male might have more time to devote his life to the worship of God. And so she was a little bit disappointed, but God says something very interesting to soothe Mary's mother. God says, listen, a male is not like a female, right? A male is not like a female. And that was basically his answer, right? His answer. And so it's very interesting because if we look in the Arabic language, or we could say if we look in the Arabic philosophy, because Arabic is so much so a philosophy and not just a language, and the more you study it, you realize why the Qur'an was revealed in this particular language. So if you look at the word for feminine in the Arabic language, now the word for feminine to designate the gender of a person could also be used to talk about the quality of land. So if you said that a land was quote-unquote feminine, you meant that it was soft. You meant that if you put seeds into it, things would grow. You meant that it was fertile, that you would get a good return on your investment. And if you say, of course, a feminine person, you mean a woman. But the Arabs would also say something else. They would say a feminine woman, which seems a bit redundant. But what they meant was a perfect woman. This was their way of saying a perfect woman. And they meant that this is the kind of woman that if you gave her good, she would give you better, right? If you gave her good, she would give you better. If you gave her seeds, just like if you give a good land seeds, you would get fruit, and you would get cornfields, and you would get flowers. And that's what they meant when they said a feminine woman. And so Mary is this example of a feminine woman, quote unquote, of a perfect woman. Because what did she do? She took what God gave her. She took, the seed that God gave her, which in this case is a human seed, and she did what? She turned it into Jesus, right? That's what she did. And so just like with good land, you put a good seed in it, and you get something better, right? You say the fruit is better than the seed. Well, that's the same thing that happened with Mary. She was so perfected, and she had such a perfected heart, and such a wide open heart, such a functioning, alive heart, that's what she was able to do. She was able to take that seed of Jesus and make it into that man of Jesus, right? And so it's interesting that the same quality for a perfect heart and a perfect woman stand, that they both should be receptive. They should both be able to take something good and make something better, right? And so Mary is another beautiful example of a wide open heart. And one of the poets, or one of the sages of this ummah, he wrote a beautiful poem about the Prophet ﷺ, which people often sing. And in the chorus of this poem, he wrote, Marhaban, marhaban, ya nur aini. Marhaban, marhaban, Jadid Hussein. He said, welcome, welcome, O light of my eyes. welcome, welcome, O Father, O grandfather of Hussein. And so we can take a very interesting lesson from this because Habib Umar is alive today. He wasn't alive in the time of the Prophet. So when he says marhaban, when he says welcome, he's not saying welcome Prophet into my physical house, you can come inside. He's saying welcome Prophet into the house of my heart, right? That my heart is wide open. And even if you look at the very letters of this word marhaban in the Arabic, it means something wide open. It means something magnanimous, right? Someone of great spirit. And so that's what this poet is saying. He's saying, you know, my heart is wide enough for you. I'm going to make room for you in my heart. And that's the quality that our hearts are supposed to have. And so when we make mistakes, as we often do, and when we have a conflicted self, as my sister was talking about, then, you know, the right thing for us to do is always to return back to God. And like she was saying, you know, we make mistakes and we return back to God and we ask Him for forgiveness, but it's not only that when we're asking God for forgiveness. We're not asking Him simply to wipe our slates clean. We're asking to draw near to Him, right? We're not saying, okay, God, just don't take me into account for this. We're saying, no, I made a mistake and I want you to help me out. I want you to bring me a bit closer on account of my mistake, not despite of it, on account of it. And so we should remember that anytime that we're inspired to ask God for forgiveness, we should also thank Him, because God doesn't inspire everyone to ask Him for forgiveness. Some people He doesn't remind. And the person that, you know, asks God for forgiveness and the person that does not ask God for forgiveness, they're not the same person, right? And the person who constantly goes back to God asking for forgiveness, they're the person that God loves. God says He loves people who constantly return to Him asking Him for forgiveness, because it's not just that they want their slate to be wiped clean. It's that they want God to be closer to them, or rather they want to be closer to God. They want to really foster that relationship between themselves and God. And so, a very beautiful Hadith Qudsi is one in which God says, neither my heavens nor my earth encompass me, but rather the heart of my gentle servant encompasses me. And so this is a very beautiful hadith because God is saying, nothing I've ever made has moved me. The only thing that's moved me is the heart of my gentle servant. And so we should really feel honored for having hearts, because it's our hearts that He's talking about. It's our hearts when they're soft and supple, our hearts when we're sincere. And that heart moves God more than, you know, the splendor of the heavens and the earth, which, by the way, He created for us. He didn't create it for Himself. He said He created the heavens and the earth for adornment, as adornments for us, so that we could look at them and say, oh, how pretty. Not so that He could be moved by them. He's not moved by it. He's moved by our hearts. And so what we want to have is, ideally, a heart that is constantly prostrating to God, right? That's the highest state. A heart that is constantly being receptive to the light of God. Because they say that there are people who, they made salat one day, and, you know, went about the rest of their day, went about their lives, but their heart never got up from that position of prostration. That was the last, in a sense, that was the first and last prostration that they ever needed to make. Of course, they still keep praying, but something profound happened to them in that moment of prostration. And, you know, that's a rare person that happens to, but it can still happen. And it's important for us to try to aim to have hearts that prostrate not only during prayer, but in every moment of our lives. And God says that, you know, the servant of God is closest to Him when in prostration, right? When our hearts are down low. And so we should try to always be close to God in that way. It doesn't just have to be in prayer, it can be in any moment of our lives. And so when we're talking about the receptivity of the heart, we see that this carries through all the way into the next life. Because in the next slide, there's the beatific vision for those who are granted it, right? Where there will be some people who are gazing upon their Lord, however that will be. And you see, that's the ultimate example of God giving and the ultimate example of us receiving, when we're literally just there gazing upon his countenance, however that will be. And that's the ultimate perfected state of the human being, when they're simply just able to take things in. And so I'd like to end with something that my father used to ask me repetitively when I was younger. On our street, there are lots of trees, and they all lean in. Because, well, now I know this, but because they're trying to get the sun. And so whenever we would be walking home, well, at least the first time I remember he asked me this question. He said, Faatimah, do you know why the trees lean in? And I had no clue, especially the first time he asked me the question, because I didn't know that trees had a choice in the matter. But he said, no, the trees lean in because they need to get the sun. And they're going to do whatever they have to do to get the sun. And so that was very interesting and very peculiar to me, because I still didn't quite understand how a tree could decide to do that. But it does that, and it's a phenomenon that we see all over the place and that I see outside of my window every day. But anyway, he would continue to ask me this question, and sometimes I would think, did he really forget that he already asked me this question? Or does he really just like to ask this question? Is he trying to get me to think about something else? And so it was about a year ago that I realized a much deeper meaning to what he was telling me, which perhaps is a seed that he was trying to plant in me in the first place, is that that's what human beings have to do too, right? Human beings have to lean in and get the light wherever they can. Human beings have to be able to be receptive, right? We can't just expect for things to come to us. The tree doesn't just expect for the sun to come, and it's a tree, right? But sometimes we're that way, where we just expect for things to come. But no, if we want the light, we're going to have to lean in. So thank you very much.